Alright, this is a video where I'm going to try and do a character design just from my cat is drinking out of the toilet. Well, he's just looking into it. I'm going to try and do a character design from a book description. So I'm going to start with Professor Snape from the Harry Potter series. And one reason I am is because I just read this to my kids recently, and I went back and read some of the later books myself because I'm not quite ready to read them the moody sitting around of Harry through most of the series, the later series. And I realized that Snape, according to the birth dates on the tombstone of Harry's parents, Snape would have been about 21 at the time of Harry's parents' death, and so in the first book he would be around 32, which is younger than me. And Alan Rickman was in his 50s, in his early 50s, when he started playing the character in 2001. I went and looked that up too, because apparently this is something I spend my time with now. So I always like the idea of what characters look like in my head as well, as opposed to what they look like in films, as much as I enjoy the film iterations of various movies. But I want to try and draw him out in a way that's a little more, I could have been drawing this whole time, that is a little more in tune with what I'm thinking. I never know exactly what I think a character would look like until I draw it. I always have vague ideas. And so I think I'm just going to do a head and shoulders, and maybe I'll draw out something with a full-length body at one point or another and try that. But first I really want to think mostly about head and shoulders and try to get personality. I looked up the description in the first book, and it gives you very little other than specifying that he has a hooked nose. And so I've thought about doing these kinds of streams and such for a while, but I've never been entirely sure what to do with them. The idea, I don't really mind drawing live because I do that in class settings often, but there's something about it that isn't completely comfortable. I think partially I'm just afraid of what I will say with sitting here sketching out. But anyway, starting with blue pencil, I feel like for other artists, other artists that I see, this actually has some kind of purpose. For me, it's strictly psychological. I know that if it's blue, that I'm not going to put as much thought into it, and I'm willing to kind of just sketch around. So a few things I'm going to try to do. For one, I'm going to try and get him a pose with his head down just a little bit and his eyes up. Try and make him look a bit more sinister. When he is described in the book, it's with a hooked nose, and he's described as having very sort of sallow skin and oily hair. I think everybody knows the oily hair part. And it sounds from later descriptions, I ran across one other in the first book where it sounded like he had sort of dark, sunken in eyes, and so I'm going to try and do some of that as well. Nothing is mentioned about his chin, and so I thought about, oftentimes when you've got like a hooked nose or something, you'll get a weak chin to go along with it. I don't know about that, and so I'm just going to play around with it. Here in the beginning, I'm just sketching around, trying to find something that feels okay. I've spent too many years drawing superheroes in my spare time, and as a result, I tend to make shoulders kind of overly large, so I'm going to be careful not to oversize his trapezius muscle here and his deltoids, because that's usually where you find most of the bulk with superheroes, up on their shoulders. And I'm going to try and get the construction right. Eyes in the middle of the head, as it says in every drawing book that you'll ever pick up. And figure out what to do with mouth. Again, I'm shooting for that guy in his early 30s, bitter, young, basically a teenager in behavior. The modern 32-year-old. Hairline is tricky, especially when you're dealing with, it just says that his hair is oily. It does not specify a hairstyle. I like to imagine it's a little unkempt, but you can take that too far too quickly. But it seems to be described as long, so for the moment I'm just going to draw in something that looks a little bit longer and try to figure out where that would land. I don't think you want to go too long or he'll start to look like an 80s rock star. Instead, maybe he just has a bowl cut. That counts as long. It can just be a bowl cut, maybe with a mullet in the back. We can do that. We'll figure it out as we go. I do want his eyes to be up. Now, the way the book describes him frequently is that he's basically the incarnation of evil. Honestly, after teaching for the better part of a decade, 9 years now, I frequently find it hard to imagine Snape-like behavior, especially towards children. He basically does everything but slap them in the face when they walk into the classroom, which is impressive. And of course, the children are no nicer in return. Basically, from the moment that Harry lays eyes on him in the first book, it's just utter livid hatred. But Harry's probably pretty messed up. He did grow up in a broom cupboard. I know they went for the kind of Cinderella concept there, but truth of the matter is, if you grow up in that kind of situation, you're probably going to have some issues you need to work out. I'm going to switch over to red and start to hash out a little bit more specificity and features that I can actually find where I'm going wrong. I've got the head tilt down. It does appear to be, sort of inclined there, which for me is always more difficult than it probably should be. And I think I've got a general nose shape that I can work with. Mouth, I have not figured out yet at all. The upper lip on people ranges a great deal in length. I actually feel like I have a very compact upper lip. I just think I have a tiny mustache when it grows out. So we'll figure out what his looks like. The one thing that we can probably guess is a scowl. He probably doesn't have like a big smile. Well, that just makes him look like the Joker if I add that. So he's probably got a scowl. And I'm going to give him a fairly normal chin for the moment. And we'll decide what else to do. Maybe it's just kind of an uneven jawline. Instead of like a perfectly angular jawline, maybe there's a little bit of variation to it. Watch me end up just drawing something that looks exactly like Alan Rickman. Maybe he's got like stray hairs sticking off. I don't know, does that look oily? Or would it just be wet and lank? If my teenage years taught me anything, it's basically just soaked in oil and highly disgusting to look at. In which case he should probably have some acne as well. I don't know. I think I'm putting too much body in his hair anyway. So he'll probably need like a few of those sort of stray hairs that hang down when your hair gets oily and they just kind of fall out of place. They really don't want to stay where they're at. And I should probably just take his hair and smash it a little bit closer to the skull, as happens when something is a bit more oily. Yeah, I think that's a good choice. I was giving his hair a lot of body because I myself have extraordinarily beautiful hair with a good deal of body. And so I was probably just thinking of me, as is such. Yeah, I think that helped a lot. Okay. I feel like his hair should also be a little bit thin so that you can see his ear through. And this is something I did in grad school as far as studying ears to try and get the ears to look proper. But the constructions of ears, I admit, I've never been particularly good at them. And so I still kind of guess my way through a lot. Just throw some bumps in there. It looks kind of like an ear. Not even going to worry about it. I'll worry about it at a higher level of pencil, I guess. Okay. I do not want to furrow his brow so much that you cannot see the eye. And I wanted to hook his nose a little bit more. Basically add some bulb to what's down at the bottom. so that it comes down further. And I'll put in that little dip in the upper lip, which really helps a lot with construction. As I'm drawing, that really helps me see it. I am going to weaken his chin a little bit. I'm just going to round it out. I don't want it to be too square. And I'm going to give him kind of a more visible cheekbone so that I can emphasize kind of a gaunt face. I think that will help a little bit as I go here under the eyes and I try to put in the bags, the sort of hollowness that you get around there. Let's lengthen his face just a little bit. Just a bit. I don't know. Might get into Joker territory really fast. That's one problem with anytime you're drawing a face that has like a long sort of nose and the face is long and thin. It ends up looking very Jokerish at a certain point. And if all of your villains look that way, like if you draw Snape and you draw Loki and you draw the Joker all in this kind of similar way, I think some opportunity gets lost in that. Pop in the other eye. Maybe his eye should be generally a little bit bigger, but you know, that's okay. I feel like I can age him up and do some more damage with just a little bit of wrinkles and such. You know, furrow brow actually show some up here, but try to pin down a target age that again is not quite so old as we usually see Snape. He probably will have some shine in his hair, so we'll do something like that. Now clothing, this is a huge weak point for me. I don't know what clothing looks like that much. I don't pay that much attention to other people's clothing and my own clothing, etc. So this is, and I say that sincerely, this is a weakness. I have trouble envisioning these kinds of things. To make matters a little more complex, in the books, wizards' robes are described in the most vague sense whatsoever. It is extremely unclear what people are wearing and what is meant by a wizard robe. Sometimes even I feel like the descriptions in the book are kind of directly against what you see in the cover art and such. So I'm going to try and devise something that's a little more open but a little more flowing. I feel like in the movies Snape wears something that is essentially like this very strict looking smock, and the only argument I would have against it is that it doesn't feel necessarily as spent and exhausted and rakish as much of his other description does. It makes him seem extremely put together, I suppose. And I don't know that I would envision him with that much care being put into his appearance. Probably still would be dark clothing. That's probably mentioned somewhere in description, but I'm gonna loosen it up a little bit and try to find something else to do with it. I don't really like where that arm's positioned. Maybe I should pull it back some. Again, I'm not really planning to be able to see very much of arms and hands. I don't want to get in a fight with drawing fingers right now anyway. And I don't know, maybe it's got like a hood attached to it or something. Do they wear hoods? They have weird hats. Maybe you should have a fancy hat of some kind. I don't know. I'm probably going to give something that gives the appearance of hood hanging off the back here. And then we'll put just almost a medieval style of garb. Something modernized medieval. Okay, let's go to actual pencils. I usually do this. I do way too many layers. I'm going to shift him up in the frame a little bit. I mean, you're already getting the gist of what he looks like. I'm basically going to take this through to inks so that we get those sort of solid black areas. I feel like it's getting dark in here. It being that I haven't done this before, I don't actually know how long this is going to take me. And the sun is setting right now. It's 7:17. So we're definitely on our way down. Forgot to make a new layer. I'm also working in Clip Studio. I really like their penciling. But I'm going to be doing inking in here as well because I found an ink brush that I really like. I was kind of on the fence about this for a long time as to whether or not I wanted to attempt to do any kind of live drawing stuff on YouTube, which I guess isn't totally live because I am probably going to have to edit this some. But because I already teach, I wasn't exactly sure what purpose it would serve. But the more I kind of thought about it, the more I realized this does give me an opportunity to do something maybe with a little more depth than I get to do in an undergrad classroom where not everybody can draw, and I have to cater to that to a certain degree. I guess I should say not everybody can draw well. But here I can just kind of go through and work on it, just assuming my audience can keep up with it and has some level of interest in what's happening. Move in a little closer, zoom in a little bit. I try to avoid zooming in early on because I do not want to get hung up on details before it's important. Good old-fashioned healthy procrastination of detail, working from general to specific. And so like this nostril right here, I didn't actually think through the nostril, but I just figured out roughly where I wanted to go. Now I can go in here and think, okay, how much skin is folded around here? I imagine he has just a hint of sneer at all times, which means you're going to have a little bit of a shadow right there. You know, that disgust thing that you do where you... That doesn't feel like a disgusted face. That feels like Bugs Bunny. But anyway, something like that. You pull up the edges of your nostrils. And you give a little bit of pull along the edges of the skin. I do not know face anatomy probably as well as a lot of illustrators who have been in it as long as I have. So I'll admit that I should probably spend some time looking at the musculature and such of the face. But I feel like I've got the planes down well enough that I don't constantly have to look at a reference to get it right. I can generally do that, and that's come mostly just from a combination of life drawing and then just lots of comic pages. Drawing comic pages and trying to get the most out of it. See, he's looking a little too sinister, I think. Okay, I probably need to tamp that down. He's got sinister vibes. I also don't want him to come out just looking like a pirate from an old comic book in the 70s or something. But we'll see what we can do with. You know, inks is really where you kind of finalize the age, because it's where you decide what's actually going to be a wrinkle and what isn't. And so it might not be that he needs so many wrinkles around his eyes or something, like bags under his eyes. Maybe he just needs darkening, like that comes in with the color or something, just some darkening around those edges. So I'm going to be gentle with how many creases I put into his skin, because I can easily age him up into an old man by putting too many. Round out that chin. Not sure about that chin. I do feel like, though, when somebody has a good scowl on, you get that little bulge down here, just beneath the mouth corner. And then, of course, the shadows that come underneath the bottom lip. I got to figure out a light direction for him too. That's something I procrastinate probably too often. I should probably have the light direction figured out much earlier in this process, but I forget. Alright, let's give him an ear that doesn't look mangled. That is good enough. That looks earish. The ears are one of those things when I am working on a comic, I'll frequently have to pull up a reference. Because after all these years, those shapes still don't make a ton of sense to me. There's a lot about the human body that does. That is not one of them. Alright, I think his hair coming down in little points like this is not bad. That gives me the oily look, a sinister vibe maybe without taking it too far. I don't know. I think maybe he should be more handsome than I'm making him. I'm just trying to figure out how to insert that redemptive quality. Oh, it looks like Filch. That's what it looks like. It looks like Filch from the movie. All right, let's ease up on some of this. Let's round out some areas of his face. He doesn't look as much like Argus Filch. I knew that looked familiar. So I'm going to look for a way to distinguish him a little bit. Part of it is the hooked nose, though. Like, taking the hooked nose that far does have that effect. But I can probably also fill out his face some and get a little less of that. I'm running into that issue of Greek mythology, where I'm attempting to beautify him a little bit to add a little bit of a redemptive quality. Because that is a character element. That's something to keep in mind, something that looks a little bit sinister. And so, even though I'm doing this mostly for fun, part of my goal is to improve at character design. And character design is something that does require you to think about who the person is supposed to be. Even if I don't completely buy all the four-dimensional chess stuff from the 7th book about Snape and his motives, it seems to me to be kind of one of the weaker parts of the whole deal. Alright, put down some wrinkles here. Create some crevices in this fabric. Fabric, yet another thing that I'm dissatisfied with my ability to draw. This is pencil work that I'm doing right now, working this out. This is all stuff that I should have worked out shape-wise on a previous layer. I should have. I would have been happier for it, because here's his little collar. Number one, kind of like this coat collar. There's probably going to be shadow down there. And then, got this little shirt underneath here, where you get your buttons and such. That's an okay outfit, I suppose, for trying to figure out how wizards dress. And trying to make this kind of a bigger, sort of looser cloak, so it's really going to have kind of larger wrinkles in it. That's still guesswork, though. Cloth is something else I'm typically better off to find a reference for if I can, because depending on the type of cloth, you get different levels of folds, etc. Let's give a little spread to the coat here. See how that looks so far. That's an improvement to the face. That strengthens it up a little bit, makes him look a little younger. Again, a lot of that's going to come down to the ink, though. That's going to be heavily on the ink to figure out. Try to figure out if I want to shift anything around. The nose size is something that is probably adjustable to make him a little younger, or etc. So I mean, I could conceivably just kind of shrink it down a little bit and bring it up some, so that you maintain the hook nose, but it's not so... Yeah, actually, I think that did help. quite a bit. I have no idea why I have a tendency to make noses extra large. No idea. Okay. He looks a bit actiony in this. I think flowing the cloak outward did that. Hold on. I don't want you to be in a state of action. And this is what happens when you create poses as you go instead of at a more reasonable rate. There we go. Let's put this arm down a little more so he doesn't look like he's about to... It looks like this arm is out and he's taking a selfie. So maybe let's drop that one down a little bit more as well. Alright, I'm going to drop out the other one and just kind of go from here. Alright, ink it up a little bit. I'm going to be using this Mameo, something like that, pen. This is one that I got for free from recommendation of another artist that's free on Clip Studio. So if you have Clip Studio Paint, you can look it up in the assets and basically just use the thing, which I highly recommend. I like this one a lot, and I got to create a new layer. I can't just do things as I am. Alright, so first thing, I'm probably just going to block in the hair a little bit and just get this solid black area. There's probably still some adjustments and such that I'm going to make to the face, but right now I just need to block this area in some, and I'm going to be, as this particular brush is really good for, kind of sketchy with it. It does a good job of emulating what you get from really something like a micron, but a very thin one that still has like a thick start. So when you know, if I do a line, you get that thick start and then it tapers as it goes. I like that. I think that works really well. So let me draw out some of these strands of hair. I'll do something just toothy looking right here at first. And I'm going to fill it with black and then use the brush as an eraser to take out anything else and add texture to it, etc. Shorten them, whatever I need to do. But right now I just want to get something in here. Without the ability to see kind of the whole structure as totally black, it's harder for me to visualize what needs to be done. So we're going to take the opportunity to just kind of block it in, fill it in. See if that worked. If I left openings. Let me guess. I left openings. I left openings. Oh, and there's one right there, see? There's probably a way to automate this, but I don't know it. I actually, for as much as I use these softwares, I almost never look at the individual features. Yep, that was it. I don't know why. I never do, even with Photoshop, which I have used almost daily for probably 15 years. I don't know as much from it as you would probably guess. Okay. There's at least a block of hair. Now I'll work on the face a little bit. The only thing I don't like about this pen is how big basically the target area it shows is, as opposed to the actual size of it. It just looks imprecise while you're using it. You have to kind of ignore that and just see how it lays down. I'm not a big fan of that. I wish that was different, and again, probably something I can change, but I haven't Googled it yet. So I'm going to be pretty sketchy here. I like this pen for that reason, and so let's be sketchy. I had a bad habit for a long time of, I think, trying to get inks to look really clean, and have kind of turned away from that because I view them a little differently now. I did have a grad school professor who, in a portfolio review, say something to the effect of, when you're inking, you need to stop believing that such a thing exists as gray, because it's either black or it's white. Now, obviously, that's not true in a literal sense, because you can hatch to get gray ones, but I think his point was that I was depending far too much on hatching as a way to sort of fill things out. And I'll admit my drawings looks pretty messy, so I needed some discipline. I have put that hair in the wrong place. I needed some discipline with what I was doing, and his advice was good, but it led me for a while on trying to keep everything kind of really starkly black and white, and that was probably an overreaction. His point was valid, but I didn't necessarily perform it as well as I could have. This is another one of those. Obviously, the eye is three-dimensional. Obviously, you have a ball, and underneath it, you're going to have shading, and you're going to have variation in light. But if you're inking and you take that too far, and you actually try to capture everything that's there, you will end up with something that looks really old, because those lines are not actually so severely defined as you might think. I'm starting that eyebrow too far over. In fact, this eye in general might be too far over. I'll think about that as I go. So one thing I do frequently is I tend to put eyes out of alignment or in the wrong place and not notice them until later. But it's usually because I've got to zoom out, look at it, see more of the overall picture before I can catch the issue. I do think I was right in the pencil, and there should be a little bit of hatching there, though. Again, I'm more willing to do that than I used to be. I don't know. Eye looks fine for the moment. I might come back to it and find that I have changed my mind, but at the moment it seems fine. This is the part where I find myself wondering if there's how interesting can I make this while I'm just sitting here drawing, especially inking. Inking is just such a painstaking process, and it is, as anybody will tell you, and I certainly don't have to hit this point too hard because there's lots of other people who do, but inking obviously is not just tracing. There's a whole lot of thought about light that doesn't really come in, which I didn't really say this, but I had kind of established this as a light direction. So I've got to think about where that light direction would fall, and then try to offer up shadow areas, etc., and figure out how strong I want that to be. One of the benefits to doing this digitally that I do not have the luxury of when I'm doing traditional drawing is I can then think about, I can try out a certain depth of shadow without actually being committed to it. And that's nice. Because, for example, with his nose here, depending on the intensity of that, I could do a shadow all the way up here, kind of hiding everything, and just put that shadow in, and then that would mean that down here you would get another shadow as well. Do I want it to be that intense? I'm not sure yet, so I'll build up to it. But I'm not really happy with that sort of multi-level shadow that I'm doing right there. That looks kind of goofy to me. Maybe I don't want heavy shadows at all. We'll do some of the more intense ones like the jawline and then worry. Procrastinate your worries. There we go. For something like that, where I just need that little bulge, I'm just going to do some slim little lines. not be heavy at all. And that's one thing that helps differentiate sort of heavy wrinkles from, or it helps distinguish lighter areas of variation from heavy ones, which is relatively obvious when you think about it. But I believe when we first start inking, we're typically guilty of just kind of going too far too fast with lines and making things heavy that don't necessarily need to be heavy, and it makes characters look older and more haggard. And so sometimes we overreact to that, don't put nearly enough, and then you've got characters with basically infant faces, something that doesn't seem very realistic. I'm never sure exactly how much to delineate the lips on a given character. Depending on the ink style and such, it can have very different results. In this case, I would say that I overdid it, and I should trim this down a little bit so as not to draw so much attention, because that is a very subtle delineation on most people between the edge of the upper lip and then the underside of it, which does have variation in color, but is not often delineated by a hard line. Not enough to make it a hard line anyway. Let's figure out that ear. Put a little shadow under there. And then underneath the jawline here, definitely just going to have a heavy, not a hairy one, a heavy area of black. I even put the X there earlier to mark it out. I knew that was coming. I do think that I rather favor the way that I've got his shoulders a bit hunched. I think that works pretty well. It seems a bit like he's got, well, there's an unpleasantness to it, I guess, as though he is uncomfortable and on edge, which I think is probably a pretty fair description. Okay, I need to work on this hair a little bit. So, Clip Studio does this fun little thing where if you have a brush, like a specialty brush like this, and you just hit C on the keyboard, it gives you that as an eraser. And so you then have the ability to go in and, create little lines. Those are too thick. I can look at that right off the bat and know that that is too thick. So probably what I need, rather even than line thickness, is I need like an area to show. If I want something that looks a bit more oily and liquid-like, I can take that, select it, expand the area a little bit, and then just delete it out, and that'll fix that problem for me. And then on top of that, I could do a little bit of thin line work to show some more individual hair. Don't want to put those too close together. One thing I do dislike, and my students know this really well, is when you're working with ink and you're doing lines, they should always be kind of parallel lines next to each other, and if you get them too close, you can just get this hairy look, and then especially if you go up and down, it just becomes chaotic, goes all over each other. And so there is a time and place for that, but it's not as often as you might think, and I'm usually unhappy with anything I get that has that feeling to it. And so I'm going to try to be a little more attentive than that, we'll put it that way. Now, as far as this part, I feel like he needs a large area along here that is essentially that sheen that you get. So if you look up any kind of hair with intense lighting on it, you get something that's fairly oily looking, and it has this sheen that runs kind of across the middle, like a peak area where it's facing the light, and you get something that's significantly more intense there. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put that in there. Is that right? Look up my little navigator in the corner, because I find that looking at it from a distance is helpful. You can also just zoom out and look at it. That might be more than I need. Okay. Downside to the whole turn your brush into an eraser thing is you forget that it's there. Disconnect that one. Come up. This is a David Finch trick. He talks about it all. If you want to see somebody who draws really well, look up David Finch. Start from your area away from the light to put down the heavy part of it, and then move up towards the light source with the rest. And that's what gives you that nice little taper that's going to run and feel more like it's collapsing in, and that gives you a little bit of gradient effect. And I'll do that in a few places, just kind of strengthening some of them up. And out here, this would really be reflected light, because we don't see all that much of this side. And it's one of those things that at that level of brightness with the light source actually being over here, I would probably do in coloring, or if I do grayscale, go in and sort of tamp that down some and not have it be quite so intense. I'm out of coffee. Yeah, that's barely anything. I'm probably going to do that thing where there's an edit and I come back with a cup of extra coffee. But I got a few minutes. I can survive. Same as when I'm teaching, I like to have a mug in my hand. So I do consume a lot of coffee. It's a fairly inoffensive drink. Sometimes I'll switch to tea. Wow, that is not an interesting topic of conversation. Why would you care? Okay. What I'm trying to do right now is kind of fill in this and have it look. You do want the hair to be broken up into sections, but then in those sections, I try to include variation, hairs that stick off, something that makes the spines that I've created a little less perfect. And also, it's a pretty easy system. That's one that works even if you're inking traditionally. You just kind of block in areas, and then you go in with something, and you can add strands to them. Because with hair, you're always going to have like the random strand that sticks off or something like that. Especially if the hair's a little bit unkempt. It doesn't even have to be really far, but there'll usually be something that doesn't quite line up, and it adds a little bit of motion to it and gives you some of that idea of sfumato, the Italian notion where it behaves a bit more like smoke. Put some shine there, considering that is one of the places where we get a lot of it. The sun just popped through and hit me in the eyes right there through the blinds. It's peeking through the trees, so ignore that for the moment. Alright, I want to spend most of my time and effort on his head and getting that filling right, so I'm not gonna spend as much time here. I lost that little bit of sneer, didn't I? I didn't translate that over into inks. That one sort of coming off right here. That might be too much though. That might actually age him slightly, or it can add emotion. I'm not 100% sure yet, so we'll let it sit for a minute, and then I'll figure out what I think of it after that point. Right now, I'm going to try and give him his darkened cloak. So for right now I'm just going to block all this off. I've got a brush in Photoshop that I would typically use for this kind of stuff, but we'll stick with this for the moment. I usually work in a combination of the two. There was a hole. Where I'll do pencil work in Clip Studio, as I'm doing right now. And then I'll finish up in Photoshop, and I'll do coloring in Photoshop and things like that. But for these purposes, I'm going to try and keep it to just one software. There we go. Do that. Come down here, add a little bit of shadowed area. There would be even more of one right here. There we go. I'm not sure how I feel about the hood or anything yet. You can probably tell just from the short section of this that you've seen is I second guess myself a lot, and usually for the better. It's not always a bad thing. It's just usually with a little time, if I look at something, I can come up with a better way to do it. And frequently I'll let drawings sit for quite a while. I do this with my comic pages. I let them sit for weeks before they get published, and then I go back and look at them again, and I figure out changes that I can make. I'll change the structure of somebody's body, face, etc. And it's generally for the better. I put very little stock in inspiration. It does not serve me all that well. Usually if something that I'm really inspired for, oftentimes it's just because I hadn't had enough time to look at it and find its flaws and improve it. So I'm pretty okay with the idea that maybe inspiration isn't that great, and that it's just coming back to it and doing the work that will get you where you want to go. I gotta figure out something to do with the bottom, which right now is just kind of a harsh line. Slim that down a little bit. I like to have that little visible distinction between sleeve and shirt without emphasizing it too much. Good heavens, my back. This is a pretty strong indicator of my own age at the moment. I'm just sitting at a weird angle. I think the camera is frightening me. No. I can't aim. But this is one benefit of inking this way. It's pretty hard to follow a line on digital. It's just difficult. You know, you don't have rulers, you don't have French curves, you can't do any of those drafting tool things that you do when you're working traditionally. But you do have the ability to make a swipe, hit Control Z, make it again until it just happens to land in the right place. And eventually you get pretty good at this and you don't have to do it as much. I just had to do it like 5 times in a row. Let's see. See, in areas like this already, I can add a little texture, but I'm not interested in actually trying to delineate all of the possible areas of light. That doesn't seem particularly interesting to me. Okay, I'm gonna disappear the pencils from underneath it and actually start to think about the inks now. as to whether or not they're a bit too much, too heavy, does he have too many wrinkles, etc. My gut says yes, so it's a matter then of which ones do you remove. I feel like some of these up here I can just lighten, because again, it typically is just going to mean that the density is too great, and so if I take them and I remove bits of them, I can sort of reduce the age of the character as a consequence. So let's take that out, and let's keep the sneer, but just kind of push it upwards and kind of flatten out the face a little bit. And I'm going to take some of these lines and just make them less. I'll go a little bit overkill and see how much that helps. Again, I don't want Filch, I want Snape. A Snape with a relatively accurate age. Why not? Okay. So maybe instead of that being quite so dark and so sunken, I can lighten it up with just a few layers of... That looks younger. That looks better. I don't know, your tendency, at least mine, whenever I'm looking at something, though, is just add lines. I just want to kind of run around here adding lines all over the place. Okay, let's try a little bit of under painting, and frequently I regret this, and I think to myself I should have just gone back and not done this stupidity. But I'll take some transparent watercolor and I'll put on like a not quite mid-tone but a little below mid-tone. We'll call it 3/4 because you can put it in relatively softly here, and I'm going to try and show the light conditions by just sort of painting this in. We'll put in... The reason why I typically, or I won't say typically, but I often regret this, I don't think I'm particularly good at it. I don't think I'm great at painting value underneath inks. I start to take it too seriously. I treat it like a realistic painting, which I'm reasonably comfortable with, especially digitally. But that doesn't always mesh nicely with ink. It just doesn't. So you end up with occasionally problems created where you've just gone too far with it. So I'm going to go too far with this and see what happens. See, that does not feel right. But let's keep going with it. Let's just see what happens. We'll darken here underneath the nose, and we'll put in the shadow that I thought about doing as ink, but instead decided that it was too much. And so that gives me license a little bit as well to kind of restore some of these areas of wrinkle that I was thinking about without it becoming as severe, because instead of using a harsh black line, I'm using something that's quite a bit softer. And so he would probably be casting a shadow here across his shoulder, at least his head would be. Darken a little bit more in there. Think about the planes of the face as best I can. And it looks like I've got a little bit of overrun right there. And then I had thought about as well darkening around his eyes. So let's try a a brush with like a transparent watercolor, and I'll take it really dark, and what I'm going to do is just create kind of a general darkening around the eyes. Something that just looks a little more sunken. I mean, I think that actually does help a little bit. I'm looking over I've got another TV over there that shows me at a different angle. Well, not really a different angle, it just shows me a different distance. That's okay. The neck is really odd right here. Basically, I didn't delineate anything underneath the neck, and so it's hard to tell where his head actually meets his collarbone. And as a result, that feels a little bit awkward. All in all, though, I'm reasonably okay with the face as it is. And I put in the value. I haven't really gone in and shaped anything back up. You know, putting highlights back in some places. I just kind of roughly ran over it really quickly. But it looks okay. It does give me the light direction. It gives me a chance to sink in around the eyes a little bit, which I like. I just frequently I'll find that when I put in paint and then I go in and I take it off, I like the ink better. I just prefer ink by itself. And this is probably no different. The one thing I'm going to try and fix before I wrap this up is to do something down here that kind of helps show where the neck does meet. And so that means just kind of adding a shadow in here and putting in that sort of center line where you're going to see basically, I don't know what they're called, these little tendons that run down to this V point underneath. Just some indication that those are there. And then usually that's going to be fine. Should I hatch here? Should I do that? Maybe. Maybe. I'm a person who's unsure of myself. It's okay. It's fine. It does okay. Alright. So, last thing I'll do. I've never made this brush big to see what it looks like. Let's try that. That looks horrible. You get this a lot with a large one. Like you'll do that and you get this really sort of awkward taper because the brush is not designed to be that large. So, is what it is. This says it's for effect line. I don't remember what this does. Wow. I have not used you in a while, clearly. Okay, we'll just do... Oh, I hate that one too. That was me. I sounded like I was sure of myself. Let's find like a marker or something. There we go. That's okay. That's fine. I ran out of space. Look at that. His name is now Snape. Put the E down there. It amazes me. There's some things I just never seem to fully get past. I don't actually look to see how much space I have to write a name. And so I'll end up doing something like that where I drop a letter in an attempt to make it look cool. And then, of course, for the very last act, all of these things they have to be signed. So, you know, I put my that's huge. I'll put my name on it because obviously everybody, when I draw something, it's so valuable that they will attempt to steal it. They will attempt to pass it off as their own, as though this is a skill that's difficult to attain. Alright, well, that's pretty much it for the first one. I'm going to think of other literary ones, or if this actually accrues enough audience that people want to comment, feel free to comment ideas. But I'm interested in taking especially characters from literature or something that I can re-envision from an original source as a character design and play with that. That's something in particular that I want to test myself on for the time being. So if you have suggestions, feel free to provide. Otherwise, I'll be putting one of these up again soon.